Today on Co-op for Two, City of Six Moons. Is it a board game or is it a puzzle? And if it's not for everyone, is it for you? Stay tuned to find out. Let's start with some facts. City of Six Moons was released in 2024. It has generated some buzz in the board game space. It is created by designer Annabelle Holland, who has her own website selling her games. It does feel like a very indie sort of handmade game here. I paid about $40, ordered it directly from the website. I have no relationship with the publisher. It is essentially a solo experience in terms of the game that's inside and the nature of the puzzle solving. However, I do think, like some of the better puzzles, there is lots to say for playing this with others, or at least talking to others who are also trying to solve this and sharing ideas. There is an active Board Game Geek forum for the game where you can share ideas as you try to solve the puzzle. In terms of what components you get in the box for $40, you get shockingly little. You're really not paying for components, or maybe a better way to say it is you're paying for a very small print run indie developer box. So you may be a little surprised by how little is actually in the box for your money. You can watch my playthrough on this YouTube channel, 2 sessions, about 5 hours total. But let me open up this box and show you what you get inside. So there's a little back of the box narrative, but you basically get a 7-page rulebook, a stack of cards, I forget whether there's 24 or 48, and some tokens, some of these blue wooden discs and a couple player pawns. And this little piece of fabric is your board. So let's take a look. You've got a bunch of cards with symbols. Double-sided, and then you've got your rule book, which is really the majority of what you'll be spending your time with here. And you can see the idea. We've got a board game whose rules are explained entirely through symbols. The idea is that this is an alien board game written in an alien language, and you'll have to decipher the rules in order to play the game. All right, let's try to do a little bit of a bottom line here before I get into some more thoughts. In this box are basically 2 things. One is a puzzle, the puzzle of figuring out the rules. And the other is the solo card game that you have at the end after you've figured out the rules. Let's start with that second half, the solo card game that you're going to have when you finish figuring out the rules. I don't think it's likely you're going to get much enjoyment, if any, out of the actual game once you figure out the rules. And I'll get into why that is in a little bit. However, as a puzzle, as a deductive experience, trying to solve the rules, it is really quite a unique puzzle experience, a long one, a very satisfying one, and just a very different kind of experience. For those of you who enjoy puzzles, figuring things out, I do think what we have here is almost a unique experience and a potentially uniquely satisfying experience that's going to challenge your ability to solve puzzles in different ways than you're used to. And I'll go into a little bit more detail with that next. Okay, so let's just tie a bow on my claim that you're not going to enjoy this game once you figure out the rules. I'm sure there are going to be some people that disagree with me. But basically what we have here, when you figure out this solo game, this is not a spoiler. I'm not going to tell you anything about the nature of the game. But what you're getting is a very dry, themeless, narrativeless card game that is fairly generic. And I really think you're going to be hard pressed to want to play this game beyond what's involved in solving it. Now, some people have asked whether different groups are going to come up with different rule sets so that essentially you will get your own custom game because you'll interpret the rules differently. And I really don't think that's going to be the case. I really think this is much more usefully viewed as a puzzle, where there really is basically one set of rule explanations that's going to be consistent and make sense. There's going to be little differences in how you interpret certain things than others, but you're basically going to get the same game as everyone else if you take it seriously. If you just glance through this and say, let me just come up with my own rules, then maybe you're going to get something different. But there's enough specifics in here that to make it make sense, there's really only going to be the minorest variations between how different people play the game. And I think if you watch my video and look at some of the comments, it feels like there's some opportunity to try to figure out some deeper meaning to the game. But I think, well, I'm going to come back to that. But I really think you're going to be hard-pressed to find this here. If you're hoping for a game at the end of this that you're going to enjoy, I really think you're barking up the wrong tree. That's not what's in this box. Now we'll spend the rest of the review talking about this as a puzzle, because I do think that's the proper way, the most useful way to think about this experience. Now, if you get 6, 7, 8 hours of enjoyment solving a puzzle out of a $40 game, that's really not bad. That compares pretty well to many of the puzzle mystery games we play on this channel. There's not much by way of physical components, and almost all of your time is just going to be spent decoding this rulebook. And you really could present this game almost entirely just as a rulebook. These cards are not, and these things are not that useful, except it is fun to be able to play the game and see how much works. But let's talk about the experience of solving this as a puzzle. The first thing to note that makes this so different as a puzzle compared to most of the puzzle experiences that people play has to do with domain knowledge. Most of the time when you think about creating a puzzle, a goal is to not require the player to know facts that not everyone knows, right? So most puzzles, unless it's like a trivia puzzle or a crossword puzzle, most of the time when you've got a puzzle, especially a puzzle game, you don't want to require the person to be familiar with the plays of Shakespeare or whatever, because then those who aren't going to be able to solve it. What we've got here, though, is domain knowledge of a very unusual type, and that is familiarity with rule books and with the symbols used in rule books and the kinds of things that a rule book has to explain. And that creates a very unique puzzle here, because as you go through this, trying to figure out, well, what does this mean? What is this saying? What is this trying to explain? All of your knowledge about board game rule books and how board games work and what would be a fair rule and what has to be explained in a rule and how does a game end and win and get scored, all of that domain knowledge, all of that specific experience with board games is important in making sense of these rules. And if you tried to solve this as a puzzle, but you had no experience playing board games, I think you're going to have a very hard time. And part of the reason is that this isn't a pure deductive puzzle in the way that we tend to expect puzzles to be. We tend to expect a pure deductive puzzle to have a single right answer and only one consistent right answer with no ambiguities when you get to the end. You don't want a crossword puzzle where you could really come up with 30 different possible solutions and some are more likely than others. But here, there are ambiguities. It's not a perfectly pure puzzle. And I think those expecting a really pure puzzle experience may be frustrated or disappointed because there are clearly gaps in this rulebook. There are things that are explained ambiguously. There are things that aren't explained well enough. And there's a whole history of ambiguity in language and what sort of biases we bring to language that helps us resolve ambiguities. This touches on all of that stuff a little bit. But my main point is that even bringing your board game domain knowledge to the table, there are going to be pieces of the rules that you're going to have to just say, well, the rules are not going to give me one specific way to resolve this tiny little case. I'm just going to have to come up with what I think is a reasonable guess about this particular little rule that would make sense and make it a better game. And that's an interesting thing to be able to bring your domain knowledge into this. Most of the rules, I think, if you take this seriously, if you try to explain the symbols, I think when you get a consistent explanation of the symbols and the rules, you're going to be fairly narrowly constrained in the game rules. But there are going to be little elements that you'll have to take a leap of faith on. So there's that experience, and then you've got, this is the puzzle basically, with a little bit here, and then you've got the components that can let you try out the game and see what works and what doesn't. The other thing that's unique about this experience that some of us who work on these kinds of puzzles really love the feeling of when it happens is a combination of, number one, just being thrown off into the deep end. So, and well, let me just say, the idea of having nothing to grab onto. You're basically, it's all alien language. There's basically nothing to give you a solid foundation to grab onto, other than noticing things that you're used to seeing in a board game rule and the order of pages and whatever. But there's that feeling, that wonderful feeling of being totally unmoored, not knowing where to start. And then the second part of what's so interesting about the experience of solving this puzzle is how nonlinear it is. It's sort of like, well, where should you start? And each little time you make a little bit of progress, it seems to help constrain something else. So I do think you'll be jumping around and you'll say, well, okay, this, I think I know what this means. So let me just start writing those rules down on my notes. And then I don't have no idea what this means. And so you'll do the parts that seem like you can make some progress. And there are certain parts you're going to say, well, it could be this, I'm not sure. And you'll be jumping around this puzzle, trying to constrain possibilities until you finally basically get it all figured out and feel like, okay, I think I know enough to play the game. Maybe I don't understand this one really weird part, but when I start simulating the game, maybe I'll realize that there's some piece I didn't know and maybe this will help explain it. If you watch our playthrough, the other really enjoyable part from a puzzle solving perspective is you're going to be wrong with early theories. You're going to say, okay, I think this means this, or I think on this card, this is what it's trying to say. And you'll have to form these working hypotheses. But then you're going to get further along or start to try to play it. You really can't really play it until you work out most of the rules. But at some point, you'll say, you know, that hypothesis doesn't work. It doesn't work because it doesn't create a game. It fails, or it doesn't handle this situation, or it doesn't explain what happens in this case, or it just is inconsistent with other rules. And I think that's a very enjoyable feeling, and it's not one we often get in puzzles. It's much more common that you figure something out and it gets locked in. And you figure something out and you're like, yeah, that gets locked in. Here you're going to have to make tentative solutions, and then you'll have to revise them. And while I think it's true what I said, that at the end, after you come up with a consistent explanation of the rules, I think your solution is going to be very similar to anyone else who's come up with a complete, consistent solution. I don't think that's going to be true along the way. At the halfway point, your theories of what things mean and what symbols mean could be quite different from others. And that's one of the reasons why I think there's going to be a lot of fun to be had by sharing ideas with someone who works on it at the same time. Let's talk a little bit about some questions people may have and wrap up with some other thoughts about missed opportunities. People have asked whether there is a correct solution, and the designer has said that she's not going to provide a correct solution. And I want to go a little bit further than that. I have tried to make the case that this isn't a pure deductive puzzle in the sense that there are ambiguities here that this does not resolve. And that's just the nature of this. I think you have to view this as mostly a puzzle, but a puzzle in which there's not a logically consistent single solution. But I do think you'll be able to get mostly the same solution as everyone else. There are a couple of groups on the internet that have tried to put together their summary of rules, and I do think it makes sense. I do think you're going to need to take notes and write up your theories of what each page of the rule book means and what each symbol means. If that doesn't sound fun to you, then you're not going to enjoy this game. But I think if it does sound fun, it's a little bit of like translating a foreign language and trying to translate what the symbols mean, decoding an alien language. If that appeals to you, that's what you're going to be spending most of your time doing. How long is it going to take? I think you're looking at least 4 to 5 hours of thinking and trying to solve this puzzle and writing up notes. It wouldn't surprise me if you didn't get 10 hours of serious puzzle solving, note taking out of it. I don't think maybe you'll spend a half hour actually playing the game afterward or playing a variation to make sure it works, but I don't think you're going to be spending much time after you solve it. And as I said, you can get online, share your ideas, and see what sort of a community consensus is of the rules. So let me give you my rating, and then I'll talk a little bit about some thoughts on the nature of this as a puzzle and missed opportunities. For me, I think I would probably rate this as an 8.5 or 9 as a puzzle. And to me, I think this is properly judged as a puzzle, not a game. It is unique, it is satisfying, it requires you to think about solving a different kind of puzzle in a different kind of way. And the thing about bringing in your knowledge of board games and board game rules is a very unique experience and very satisfying to be able to say while you're thinking about these puzzles, let me take my entire knowledge of experience of playing board games and reading rules and be able to use that to make inferences about what this is probably trying to do. But I don't think everyone's going to love this puzzle. And I do think if you don't have any board game experience, if you don't have experience reading rule books, this could be quite frustrating. And you could feel like there's not enough information here for me to solve this puzzle. Maybe it'll just be a more difficult puzzle. I'm not 100% sure, but I do think you're going to miss out on some of the enjoyment if you have no familiarity with board game rule books. And those expecting a really pure puzzle that when they finish, they know it's exactly right. I think people who don't like the idea of the ambiguity may be a little bit frustrated. And those of you who really want a game at the end that's fun to play, or who are expecting to each have their own different custom game, are going to be disappointed. And I think those expecting a deeper narrative storytelling experience, a sort of story that involves this alien culture, are going to be disappointed. But if you are a lover of deduction and puzzles, especially the idea of translating an alien language, and you have some familiarity with board game rules, I do think you are in for something really special here. And if you have someone that you can discuss this stuff with, someone similarly minded who would be interested in working on this with you and debating ideas, I think this is one of these things that would benefit from having two minds working on it, and one person saying, could this be this? And another saying, well, I don't think that makes sense because of this and this and this over here and this symbol. I think really you could have some really enjoyable debates and discussions with another person, another like-minded person. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about missed opportunities. I think it's likely we're going to get more games that are riffing off this idea. And I think, I'm trying to think the best way to say this. I think in some sense, the idea here is so phenomenal. The idea of this as a puzzle, of trying to decode the language and symbols of this game to find out the rules to give you a playable game. This idea is so good that it creates a great experience while being what I'm trying to say kindly is this is almost the worst implementation of this great idea. Why do I say that? As someone who plays these puzzle games with some narrative appeal, there's a total lack of theme, narrative, of anything interesting other than this puzzle of understanding the rules. And that's a real missed opportunity, because most of the puzzle games we play, that I play at least, are not pure abstract puzzles, which is basically what this is. It's a pure abstract puzzle with some ambiguities. And I think if you took all the lessons from crafting more satisfying puzzles with stringing some narrative along, with getting rid of ambiguities, or making interesting cultural statements, or making a puzzle that has multiple acts that unfold and have reveals, I think there's a real opportunity here to take this idea and create a much more satisfying puzzle experience from it. Whether that's the narrative and storyline, or whether it's in making surprises in the rules and the what unfolds, how the game might work, or the consequences of how the game might work, I think there's lots of room to do interesting stuff. You could imagine a puzzle. So this game is sort of framed. The narrative behind this is, here's a found game that aliens were playing, and that's basically it. But you could imagine if you made a similar thing where, this rule book is going to explain whether these aliens are out to harm us or help us, or solving this is going to result in the saving of an alien race, or explaining what their purpose is, what their mission is, or solving a conflict between two rival civilizations. There's stuff you might be inclined to want to give to this game, but there really isn't enough here to hang that on. But you could imagine a game, a multi-part game, where you first get one set of components and then get another, or there's some narrative that gets unlocked, or a story that gets told in multiple acts. Or you could imagine pursuing the other thing that people were interested in, was that could you design something like this where each player is going to get a different set of rules at the end? Might you go in the other direction? Instead of trying to remove ambiguity, could you make a game like this that was a puzzle, but had almost like legacy game elements, where each group would be modifying the rules, coming up with their specific stopgap rules to get rid of the ambiguity that would result in different games for different groups. And maybe part of the challenge there would be, what rules can you come up with? What interpretations can you come up with that you think would make for a better game? And I don't think that's here, but it is an interesting possibility. All right, this is going to be a game that people like to talk about. I'd like to hear your thoughts. I suspect we will see more games of this flavor coming to us in the near future. Let me know your thoughts. I'll see you on the next video.